Today we're going to be reading the next chapter in this exciting series. So, turn on your lights if you're faint of heart. If you're brave, turn them off. And then get comfortable. The Dunwich horror itself came from Lamaze of the Equinox in 1928, and Dr. Armitage was one of those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard meanwhile of the Whateleys' grotesque trip to Cambridge, and of the frantic efforts to borrow or copy from the Necronomicon at the Windsor Library. Those efforts have been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity to all librarians having charge of dreaded volume. Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as if he feared the results of being away too long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome developed, and in the small town of the third Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdogs of the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different throat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers of the Arkham, and haunted their dreams ever afterwards, such a scream as such should come from no being born of this earth, of holy in matrimony of this earth. Armitage, hastening into some clothing and rushing across the street and lawn to the college building, saw the others were ahead of him, and heard the echoes of a burglar's alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance, for the barking and the screaming, now fast fading into a mixed low growling and moaning, proceeded unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was not a thing for unfortified eyes to see, so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the versatile door. Among the others he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told of his conjectures and misgivings, and these too he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for a watchful droning whine from the dog, had by this time quite subsided by Armitage. Now perceived with suddenly start that a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced, a damnably rhythmic piping, as if in unison with the last breaths of a dying man. The building was full of a frightened stench, which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and 3 men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room whence the low whining came from. For a second nobody dared turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the 3, if not certain which, shrieked aloud at what sprawled before them amongst the disordered tables and overturned chairs. Professor Rice declares that he wholly lost consciousness for an instant, though he did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and spasmodically, while its chest heaved in monstrous union with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. Bits of shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered across the room, and just inside the window an empty cabinet sack lay where it had evidently been thrown. Near the central desk a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge, later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images at the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it, but one may properly say that it could not be visibly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet, and of the 3 well-known dimensions. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, and a goated, chinless face had the stamp of the Whateleys upon it. But the torso and lower parts of the bodies were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could ever have enabled it to walk on earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog-rendering paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery, retricked hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous coverings of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human resemblance left off, and sheer fantasy began. The skin was covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red suckling mouth protruded limply. Their arrangement was odd, and seemed to follow the systematics of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or the solar system. On each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish dilated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, whilst in the lie of tail there depends a kind of trunk or feeler with purple annular markings and with many evidences of being undeveloped. Mouth or throat. The limbs, save for their black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric earth giant sauruses, and terminated in ridgy veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some surgically caused normal to the non-human side of its ancestry. In the tentacles this was observed as a deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifest of a yellowish appearance, which alternated with a sticky grayish-white, and space between the purple rings of genuine blood there was none. Only the fetid greenish-yellow ichor was trickling along the painted floor beyond the radius of the stickiness, and left a curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written records of the mouthing, but asserted confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of earth, but towards the last three came disjointed fragments evidently taken from the Necronomicon, the monstrous blasphemy in a quest of which Thanes had perished. These fragments, as Archimate recalled them, ran something like this. Negiai nogamash muruskotgar yahars yostur. They trailed off into nothingness, as Whippoorwill shrieked in rhythmically conscious of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt, and the gasping, and the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellowish, goatish face, and the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurs of the gathered crowd, there came the sound of panic-struck, whirring and fluttering against the moon's vast claws of the feathery watchers rose, and raced from sight, frantic at which they sought for prey. All at once the dog started to abruptly, gave a frightened bark, and then leaped nervously out the window by which it had entered. A cry rose from the crowd, and Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the police or medical examiner came. He was thankful that the windows were just too high to permit the peering in, and drew the dark curtains carefully down over each one. By this time 2 policemen had arrived, and Dr. Morgan's meeting them in the vestibule was urging them, for their own sakes, to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came, and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind and rate of shriekage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice. But impossible to say that aside from the external appearance of the face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whatley must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whatley's had no skull or bony skeleton, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father. Yet all this was only the prologue of an actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through and through by bewildered officials. Abnormal details were duly kept from the press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Alsla to lock up the property and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Whatley. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the doomed hills, and because of the unwelt stench and surging lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell from by which the Whatleys boarded up Frome House. Earl Sorrow, who tended to the horses and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased living quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filled a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aldersley. The litigations concerning heirship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerable Watleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Mississippi Valley. An almost intermediate manuscript in the strange character, written in a huge ledger and adjudged a sort of diary because of the spacing and the variations of ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it. On the old bureau which served as the owner's desk, after a week of debate, it was sent to Muskoka University, together with the deceased collections of strange books, for study and possible translation. But even the best linguist soon saw that it was not likely to be an unriddled case with ease. No trace of the ancient gold which Wilbur and the old Watleys paid their debts has yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill's noise had been very pronounced during the evening, and the dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's, believed Cold Springs Glen in the village, rushed freezingly back from his morning trip to Traker's Mecca with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard outside the no less frightening herd were falling and lowing pitifully. Having followed the boy back in a panic they shared with him, between gasps Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Miss Corey. "Up thar in the road beyond the glen, Miss Corey, there's something been there. It smells like thundering and all. Bushes of little trees is pushed back from the road. Your house has been moved along it, and in the worst nutter there's prints in the road, Miss Corey, great rounded prints, as big as barrel heads, all sunken down deep in the elephant. How long only they a sight for no 4 feet can make. I looked at one or two before I run in and see everyone was covered with lines spreading out from one place like it's a big palm leaf found twig to twig. Things times have come. He'd are pounded down with the rod, and its smell was awful, like that of the wizard Watley's old house." He a little flattered and seemed to shiver afresh with fright that had been sent him flying home. Miss Corley, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors. "Do you hear that?" Here he faltered. When she was telephoning the neighbors, the rounds were overturned in panic. The heralds of the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer's housekeeper at Seth Bishop near his place of Watley's, it became her turn to listen of the transmit. For Sally's voice, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill toward the Watley, and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place and all the passengers with. Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sal's tremendous voice over the partry wire. "Chauncey, he's just been back on the position, and couldn't happen to have been talking about a scare. He says old Watley's house all blowed up, all with timbers scattered round like he's been dynamited inside. Only the bottom floor ain't though, but it's all covered with a kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down off the narrages, and gorded around the side of timbers have blown away, and they're awful kinder marks in the yard too. Great rounded marks a bit around out of the hogshead. It's all stinky with the stuff of a blowed-up house. Chauncey, he says, it leads off some meadows when a great swath right at the barn is matted down of all stone walls and tumbled every which ways, wherever it goes. And he says, Miss Carberry, and how did he thought look for it, safe cows, frightened as he was, have found them in the upper pasture and idea in the devil's hot yard. An awful shame. Half on, it's clean 'em gone. It's night and half of them left is soaked almost dry of blood with sores on 'em like they've been on Watley's cattle ever since Lavania's black bra was born. Seth, he's gone out there now and looked 'em up with the vowed and wouldn't care to get every night on Wizard Watley's. Chancey didn't look keen to there with the big martyr down Swathlet out there and left the parsonage. But he says he thinks he pinted down towards the Glendon road to the village. I tell you, Miss Corley, There's something aboard and has not been aboard. I for one think the black Wilbur Watley has come from the bad end he deserved, and the bottom of breeding it is it what? He wasn't all human himself, I at least say it to everybody, and I think old Watley must have raised something in there, nailed up the house, as if it isn't so human as it was. The illusion unseen things around the Dunwich, living things, as ain't human, as ain't good for human folks. The Grandin was a-talking last night towards the morning. Chauncey, he heard the whipper-pool so louder on the call at Spinning Glen, he couldn't sleep none. Then he thought he heard another faint-like sound over toward the Wizard Watley's, a kind of ripping of a tearing of wood, like some big box or crate was being opened for off. What with it and that, he didn't get any sleep at all sun-up, and no sooner when he comes to the morning. But he got to go over to the Watleys and see what was the matter. He's seen enough, I tell you, Miss Corey. The Dunwich ain't no good. And I think as well of the men folks who had to get up a party and do something. I know something awful ain't telling me the right time of night. It's only God knows just what it is. Did your Luther take account of what the big tracks have been? No. Well, Miss Corey, if one of the Glen Road side of the Glen Road's house, yet I calculate they must have been going into the Glen itself. They would have known at last Cold Springs. The Glen ain't no healthy nor no decent place to whipper-pools and fireflies. They never did act like they were creatures of gods, and they'd be showing in the year kin strange. Things rushing and talking in the air down to the earth stand in the right place between to the rock bows of din better din. By the noons fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the newly made Watley ruins and the Cold Springs Glen, examining in horror the vast, monstrous prints and maimed bishop cattle, matted vegetation of fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon the world had assuredly gone down into the great sinister ravine, for all the trees of the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gorged in the prodigious price-hanging underbush. It was as though the house, launched by the avalanche, had slid down through the tangled groups of the almost vertical slope. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefined thunder, as if not known to be wondered, as the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend into the bears of the unknown stifling horror in its lairs. 3 dogs that were with the party had barked furiously in horror at first, but seemed to cower and reluctantly when they were near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to Adlet's transcript, but the editor, accustomed to wild tales from the Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterwards reproduced by the Associates Press. That night everyone went home, and every house barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in the open pastures, and about 2 in the morning a frightful stench and savage barking of the dogs awakened the household of Elmer Fry's on the eastern edge of Cold Springs Glen, and all agreed they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound from somewhere outside. Miss Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree with her when the noise of splintering wood burst into upon deliberation. It came apparently from the barn, and was quickly followed by a hideous scream and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slaved and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be the death to go out and get back to the farmyard. The children and the womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure visceral instinct of defense, which told them their lives depended on silence. At last, the noise of the cattle subsided to a painful moaning, and a great snapping, crashing, and crackling endured. The Frys huddled together in the sitting room and did not dare to move, until the last echoes died away, far down into the Cold Spring Glen. Then amidst the dismal moans from the stables and the demonic piping of the late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fry trotted to the telephone and spread the news that she could of the second phase of horror. The next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and coward, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swarms of destruction stretched from the glen to the Friar farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of those were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested help from the outlaws of Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Watley, of a branch that hovered about half away, soundlessly and decadently, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chanting in the great stone circle were not altogether connected with Wilbur's and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken country song, too passive, too organized for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in the gloom under one roof, but in general there was only a reputation of the barricading of the night before, a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noise, and then the day came. There were many who hoped that the new war had gone away swiftly.